Hello, welcome and kumusta? Thank you for joining me. This is Pal, and I am your occupational therapist. Welcome to Occupational Therapy Conversations. So, the context and the background story for this episode is that one time, at some point in my career, I was working in an adult physical dysfunction facility, and it's a general rehabilitation. And then another locum asked me if I knew about a hangman's fracture. And this was quite out of the blue and quite out of the ordinary. And sometimes I thought, was the person asking me because the person didn't know, or was the person asking me to test me? Because when you're working as a locum, you get to encounter a lot of therapists from around the world, bringing with them lots of skills and knowledge, and sometimes you test each other in a professional way. And so I managed to answer that question that a hangman's fracture is a fracture of the C2, particularly of the odontoid process. So now, based on that, this episode is all about naming some of the common fractures in case you come across them. But this may be a simple resource for you as a tip for some of the fractures out there. And then you can just look up in more details as to what they are. Okay, so this is just a tip. Again, just me practically coaching you guys, whoever is listening, and supervising you digitally online, but you are responsible for all the facts to double check them. Okay, so I'll go with some of the list, and I have quite a few lists, and I have done it I've seen what I can do in terms of alphabetical listing. Okay, let's go with this. Barton's fracture. This is a fracture of the dorsal rim of the distal humerus, and it is a variant of the Colles fracture. So Colles fracture is a fracture of the forearm. So a Barton's fracture is on the dorsal rim. It's at the back of the distal humerus. It's a variant of Colles fracture. Bennett's fracture dislocation. It is an intra-articular fracture of the base of the first metacarpal, where the fracture line separates the major part of the metacarpal from a small volar lip, which would have been an avulsion fracture. So it's a Bennett's fracture, intra-articular. So it's happening within the joint itself, and it happens at the base of the first metacarpal bone. So what is the base of the first metacarpal? And that's the thumb down the base. And what happens is there's an avulsion fracture there. Oh, this one is a fracture of the hand. It's called boxer's or fighter's fracture. So when somebody punches, just remember somebody punching. So you can have a fracture of the neck of the fifth metacarpal. Yeah, so this would be on the ulnar side, metacarpal being the one that holds the little finger. So when you punch and you punch wrong, punch with the little finger rather than with the knuckles of the index and the middle finger, sideways punch, and that can cause a boxer's fracture. Again, I am not supporting violence, guys. Don't learn about this, just know about this, but don't apply it in practice. But if somebody comes to you and there's been an incident or a fight and there's a swelling on the ulnar side of the arm with the history, then you might think that this would be a boxer's fracture. Chance fracture is a distraction fracture of the spine, usually secondary to seatbelt injury. What are the chances? But that's the name for that. It is a fracture of a distraction fracture of the spine. A chance fracture. Colles fracture is, again, a very popular one. Fracture of the distal radius with dorsal or posterior displacement. So that's Colles fracture, especially when falling with arms in extension. And when you fall, you try to reach, and when you use the protective extension, then you break your arm. Then you get a Colles fracture. Smith fracture or reverse Barton's fracture. This one is a fracture of the distal radius with palmar or anterior displacement, usually caused by a fall on the back of the hand. Colles fractures with the outreach the hand, open palm onto the ground. There you go, you'd have a Colles fracture. But if your hand is reversed, then you might have a Smith's fracture. De Quervain's fracture is a transscaphoid perilunate fracture dislocation. So scaphoid, de Quervain's. So you'll have the lunate and the scaphoid fracture. Dupuytren's contracture, or Dupuytren's fracture rather, is a fibular fracture. So this one would be on the leg, associated with the rupture of the tibiofibular ligaments with the proximal intercrural dislocation of the talus, bimalleolar fracture with abduction of the trans. Ooh, the fibula is fractured here, and bimalleolar fracture as well. Ooh, that would have hurt. I could imagine it. Duvernay's fracture. Oh, I haven't come across this for a long time. So this is an isolated fracture of the iliac wing. Yeah, especially if you fall sideways and there's an iliac wing. It's an isolated fracture. It's got a name already. Duvernay's fracture. Here's one discovered potentially by Essex or in Essex and Lupestri. It's possibly the names. Essex Lupestri fracture, and this is a distal radial head fracture with concomitant distal radio-ulnar joint injury. Galeazzi's fracture is a single lone fracture of the radius in the distal third associated with dislocation of radio-ulnar joint. Mulgane fracture, this is an extension type of supracondylar fracture with posterior displacement of distal fragment. You can have Monteggia's fracture. It's a fracture of the shaft of the ulna with dislocation of the radial head. Lots of fracture, but you can just name it in terms of fracture of the distal head. That's even better, isn't it? It's much more simpler when you describe it like that. But there'd be people that would know, there'd be people that would ask. These are all just wonderful information. Heinsteinal capitulum fracture. Oh, capitulum. So this is a type 1 fracture of the capitulum, and it involves a large part of the osseous portion of the capitulum and may contain part of the adjacent lip of the trochlea. Okay, there you go, capitulum fracture. So it'd be a hip one. Hangman's fracture, this was the question that was raised to me. It is a fracture through the odontoid process or the peduncle of C2. Hill-Sachs fracture, and that would be a posterolateral humeral head fracture with anterior dislocation. So that is a shoulder head or a humeral head fracture. Posada's fracture, this is a transcondylar fracture of elbow extending through the condyles, through their posterior borders. Oh, that feels it. I can feel it. That probably would hurt. Another one would have been Jefferson's fracture. Jefferson's would be the one. There is a fracture. Now I remember there's a fracture of the atlas. C1 fracture, secondary to axial load on top of the head with the body in stationary. Okay. Somebody bashes you with something from the top of your head without you moving. The loading fracture, that is a C1, Jefferson's fracture. Quite a unique one. So there's two that will involve C1 and C2, Jefferson's and Hangman. Jones fracture is a fracture of the base of the fifth metatarsal. So if a boxer's fracture is on the fifth metacarpal, the fifth metatarsal would have been Jones's fracture. Kocher's fracture, which is a fracture of the capitulum. Capitulum is part of a bone, I believe on the lower leg, if I'm leg or thigh bone. Check, because I haven't come across this for a long time. Kocher-Lawrence capitulum fracture, another fracture of the capitulum that involves cartilage with very little bone fracture. Len-Tenure's fracture, this is a palmar rim fracture dislocation, almost synonymous to Volar-Barton's fracture or Thomas type 2 Smith fracture. Maisonneuve fracture. Gosh, it's a big word. High proximal third fibular fracture, secondary to yielding of tibiofibular ligament or external rotation of the talus. This one is very simple. You'd remember this. stress fracture or march fracture. It is a foot fracture secondary to marching or persistent walking, and this one involves the second metatarsal and the calcaneus bone. Moore's fracture is the luxation of the distal ulna associated with fracture of the distal radius. Nutcracker fracture is a lateral stress injury of the foot causing the crushing of the cuboid or the anterior calcaneus as the forefoot is driven laterally. The nutcracker fracture. Again, nutcracker, you are talking about the cuboid. Piedmont fracture, again, it's the same as the Gagliasi or the reverse Montegias fracture. You have Walther's fracture. Acetabular fracture. Fracture line passes through the pubic rami, and this one terminates in the region of the sacroiliac joint. You can have Pott's fracture, and this originally referred to fibular fractures within 2 to 3 inches of its lower extremity, associated with the tear of deltoid ligament and lateral subluxation of the talus. So Pott's fracture would have been, again, another one of those foot fracture. You have Rolando's fracture, and this is a comminuted Bennett's fracture. Comminuted fracture meaning there's a multiple one. There's large dorsal fragment result in a T-shaped intra-articular fracture. You have Shepherd's fracture, and this is a fracture of the lateral tubercle of the posterior process of the talus. So again, it's another one which is on the foot. Straddle fracture, which would have been a double vertical fracture, or dislocation of the pubis. Yeah, that's because when you're straddling, then out, that would have hurt. That's a pubic fracture. And how did the pubic rami fracture? Unless you get hit there in the groin, and again, usually with people onto the horse's saddle. Fracture. Nightstick fracture. Oh, when you get whacked by something. So this would have been a fracture of the shaft of the ulna without the dislocation of the radial head. Nightstick, because when somebody hits you with a nightstick and you block it, then you get that fracture. So the last one that I can think of would have been a Malgane fracture of the pelvis, which would have been a double vertical fracture or dislocation of the pelvis. There you go. These are some of the fractures out there. Lots of names, lots of interesting ones. The one that is very common that you would encounter would be the boxer's fracture. So you remember that. You have the Colles fracture or reverse Colles, which would have been Barton's or Smith's fracture. That's very common. People would know those things. You can have March fracture as well. And these are very common. Of all those names, these are the ones that have persisted throughout the years and that it's been stuck to people's head. And Hangman's fracture is one of those fracture that are easily remembered, which would have been the peduncle of the T1 or the odontoid process. There you go. That's why that's probably why I remembered and I knew what the Hangman's fracture was, because it's easy to remember. But had that staff asked me about a Walther's fracture, which would have been the ischiosacetabular fracture or fracture that passes through the pubic ramus and terminates in the region of the sacroiliac joint, I would definitely would not have remembered that. Okay, so there you go, guys. All of this information is out there. There are lots and lots. And again, possibly over the year, there are people naming these types of fractures. But how do you register these names? It makes me curious, isn't it? You discover something and then you name it. How do you patent a name? Like Parkinson's disease, isn't it? That would have been so amazing that they name it after themselves. Or Korsakoff syndrome. Yeah, it's all of these wonderful names that are out there. Thing is, they are now immortalized for those people who has coined these terms or have studied them, and it's beautiful. Okay, guys, I hope you find this podcast entertainment, if not informative. Again, I recommend please fact check. There will be some people that be questioning the authenticity of what I am saying. Then again, this is just an information, and this is a relevant information. It's a foundation information, foundation knowledge for you to be aware of, relevant information involving OT, and it can be a random information involving occupational therapy. These are not random. It's there. It's a foundation knowledge. This is a relevant information which makes this talk a riot conversation. I hope you enjoyed this session, guys. Just remember, anything you do matters and has an outcome. Until next time, bye. If you enjoyed this podcast, talk to your friends and colleagues about it. Like it, subscribe, share, and do what you can to appease whatever algorithm that is at play. Just remember, guys, anything you do matters and has an outcome. Until next time, bye.